Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
At that barbecue, with the smell of burnt ribs still clinging to the air and the chatter of relatives drifting lazily across the backyard, my parents lifted their glasses high and toasted to my sister's success as if she were the only child they had ever raised. My father's voice carried over the clinking of silverware and the laughter of cousins, praising her promotion, her new car, and her bright future. My mother's eyes glistened with pride as if she were watching a crown being placed on her daughter's head. I stood a few steps away, holding a stack of dirty plates balanced on my forearm like a waitress at someone else's celebration, realizing in that moment that not a single person had even looked in my direction, let alone acknowledged my existence. I remember gripping the plates tighter, the condensation from the half-empty cups dripping down onto my hands, mixing with the sweat already forming from the heat of the grill. My father kept talking, my mother nodding like she was hearing poetry instead of just another round of praise for the same child they had adored since she learned how to tie her shoes faster than me. I half expected someone to joke, "Don't worry, maybe you'll get a toast someday," but the silence around my name was absolute, and it was almost worse than a cutting remark. I felt like a piece of furniture, useful only for holding things until someone else needed them. The cousins chimed in, clapping my sister on the back, asking questions about her salary, her office, her upcoming business trip. She laughed, tossing her hair back like the lead actress in a scene perfectly written for her. I could hear my aunt mutter, "Such a shining star," and my mother quickly agreed, her voice a little too loud, as though she wanted to make sure the neighbors heard it too. The entire table turned into a stage where every spotlight pointed toward my sister, while I slipped into the shadows, carrying away the plates like stagehands do when the play moves to the next act. The sting wasn't new. It was the same story every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner. My sister was the golden one, the chosen one, the child who could do no wrong, while I was the extra, the one who filled in the quiet spaces and cleaned up the mess after the real show was over. Still, that night something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the way my sister barely looked at me when I took her empty glass, mumbling things like I was a stranger. Maybe it was the way my mother's hand lingered proudly on her shoulder while her other hand brushed past me as though I were just another dish towel hanging by the sink. Whatever it was, the hurt hardened into something else, something sharper, something I wasn't entirely ready to name. I carried the plates to the kitchen, stacking them with quiet precision. The laughter outside was still loud enough to hear through the window, though the pain dulled it like I was listening to another family from the outside. I stood by the sink for a long moment, staring at the smears of barbecue sauce hardened on the plates, feeling like those stains mirrored every resentment layered on me over the years. I rinsed them slowly, letting the water run longer than necessary, thinking about how silence can sometimes be more dangerous than words. When I stepped back into the yard, I didn't return to the table. I slipped past the group, grabbed my bag, and left, without a single goodbye, without a single word to mark my exit. Walking down the street, I didn't even feel anger in the way people usually describe it. It wasn't heat in my chest or a fire in my head, it was cold, steady, almost calculated. I thought about every birthday they had forgotten, every moment I was told to step aside, every time my achievements were minimized with a smile and a shrug. They had wanted me invisible, and that night, I finally gave them exactly that. But invisibility has its own weight, and when used carefully, it can crush. I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I didn't cry about them. I poured myself a glass of water, toasted silently to the fact that I had survived their neglect without completely breaking, and then I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't fight, I wouldn't try to prove myself to people who had already written my story in small, forgettable print. I would simply step out of their narrative, pull away piece by piece, and let them discover what life felt like when I wasn't there to do the invisible work, to hold up the background of their perfect little stage. By the time they realized I was gone, I had already started planning something they wouldn't forget, something that didn't need raised voices or slammed doors to make its point. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister, her words short but sharp. "Mom's been crying for hours. Did you do something?" I stared at the screen, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, because for the first time in my life, they were finally asking about me. I stared at my sister's message until the screen dimmed and, instead of answering, I set the phone face down on the table as if I were laying a lid over boiling water so it would not splatter, because the urge to explain myself always shows up first and loudest. And I have learned that explanations are a trap that turns pain into a debate and guilt into a committee decision where my vote never counts. I made tea not because I needed comfort, but because I wanted ritual, something slow and deliberate that would remind my hands they were mine. And while the kettle hummed, I opened my laptop and began doing the quiet kind of work that never gets a toast and always changes everything. For years, I had been the person who kept the background running like a well-maintained engine, the name on the shared streaming accounts no one paid for but everyone used. The family photo drive organized by month and event with tags so precise even my aunt who types like she is playing whack-a-mole could find what she wanted. The calendar that synced birthdays, dentist appointments, and school plays with automated reminders that made other people look thoughtful when all they did was show up and press send on a pre-written text. It dawned on me, in a steady, unromantic way, that I could simply stop. I did not need to throw a tantrum. I did not need a speech. I did not need permission. I started with the soft cuts that would be felt immediately but not bleed publicly. I removed every device that was not mine from my streaming profile. I changed the family plan on the music account to an individual one. I unshared the holiday albums that my mother trotted out like proof that we were close. Whenever someone questioned her warmth, and because I am not cruel, I downloaded a tidy zip of the raw originals to a folder clearly labeled for them and emailed the link with a one-line note that said the photos were theirs to keep and the responsibility was theirs as well. Then I opened the group chats that had slowly turned into bulletin boards for other people's announcements and thin praise directed at my sister like confetti that never needed a broom because I was the broom. And instead of posting a long message about boundaries or fairness or the power of being seen, I left without a word, because silence, when it is chosen, can be a scalpel that cuts away the rot without nicking the bone. I blocked no one and I muted nothing. I simply created space where their noise could not trespass, and in that space my head cleared the way a room clears after a party when the air finally remembers how to be air. Revenge is such a heavy word for what I did next, yet I cannot pretend it was anything else, because I have learned that sweetness without consequence is just permission in a different dress. Years ago, when my sister launched her first freelance site, she asked me to set it up because I am the only person in our family who reads instructions before clicking accept. And I registered the domain with my email because she was between apartments and using a borrowed mailbox. A temporary fix that turned into a permanent arrangement once her life got busy and everyone assumed the back office of their dreams would continue humming for free. I did not take anything from her that belonged to her. I did not poison the well. I did not torch the brand. I opened the registrar, switched the auto-renew off, and scheduled a transfer request that required her to confirm ownership within a generous window, which I sent to the address she uses for business with a subject line that could have been carved out of granite. Action required to retain your domain. If she read it, she would keep what was hers. If she ignored it the way she has ignored my labor, the expiration would arrive like weather, neither personal nor negotiable. My mother's name sat on another quiet piece of infrastructure that I had built and maintained because she asked nicely, and because asking nicely is how she keeps her hands from ever getting dirty. A small family LLC formed to hold the rental on my grandparents' old house. Nothing grand, but enough to need a registered agent and annual filings that no one else wanted to understand. I drafted a formal resignation as registered agent, not a tantrum but a legal act that any adult can do, and I filed it with the state portal that I have kept bookmarked for years, adding a forwarding note to their accountant so he could step in and assign a service or, if they preferred, take the reins themselves, and as I typed I felt a mixture of lightness and something close to grief, because stepping back from responsibility can feel like abandoning your younger self who begged to be needed, even when that need has been weaponized against you. I could have done more, and I could have done it with the fury of every overlooked birthday, and every seat cleared after every dinner where my name never rose above the level of a side note, but I chose precision over spectacle. Because precision is how you teach people where the value lived all along. The kettle clicked off and I poured water over the tea bag, letting it darken while I drafted a single invoice that I had no plan to send anywhere public, a private ledger with line items for website maintenance, photo archiving, calendar setup, tax reminders, subscription management, and the miscellaneous triage that fills the cracks in other people's lives, not because I needed payment, but because I needed to see the weight on paper, and when I finished I felt steadier than I have felt in years. My sister texted again, a longer message this time, trying to sound light while the edges frayed, asking whether I had changed something with the photos because my mother could not find the summer album, whether I knew why the music account was not letting her add the kids, whether I had any idea why an email had arrived saying something about a domain confirmation window, and whether this was urgent, and I considered replying with the good-natured guidance I have always provided, the tutorial voice that turns chaos into easy steps, and then I put the phone down because teaching is a gift, and I was done handing out free gifts at a party where I was asked to stay in the kitchen. The first call came not from family but from my father's accountant, who is a polite man with a dry sense of humor and a professional terror of deadlines, and he asked, with that careful tone people use when they suspect a bomb has been defused but still smell smoke, whether I had truly resigned as the registered agent, and whether the notice the state had already issued was accurate, and I said yes in the same voice I used to confirm a meeting time, because this was not a scandal, it was simply the truth. He cleared his throat, thanked me for the heads up, and said he would advise my parents on next steps, and when the call ended I saw 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 texts from my aunt with the kind of punctuation that suggests prayer chains, and a new message from my sister that read, in a tone that finally sounded like the truth behind her smile, that everyone was panicking and Mom was crying again and Dad was furious, and why was I doing this when we were family, and before I could even decide whether to answer there was a knock at my door, slow and deliberate, followed by my father's voice saying my name with the unusual softness he saves for when he wants something he does not know how to ask for. And I stood there with my hand on the knob wondering whether to open it or to let the silence finish the sentence I had started. I kept my hand on the knob long enough to hear my father clear his throat a second time, that small ritual he uses when he hopes the sound will stand in for an apology he cannot form. And I opened the door not because I was ready to make peace, but because I wanted to see whether his face would carry even a flicker of recognition that the scaffolding of our family's convenience had always been built from my unthanked hours, my small compromises, and my ability to read instructions that nobody else bothered to open. He stepped inside with that careful, almost courtly stiffness he adopts for clients and pastors, glancing around my apartment as if the furniture might offer him legal precedent. And he began with a sentence that tried to be gentle, but arrived dressed as negotiation, saying that my mother was very upset, that the photos had vanished and the music account was acting strange, and something about the business emails for my sister's website looked urgent, and could I please, for everyone's sake, put things back the way they were so we could talk like adults later, perhaps on Sunday, perhaps after church, perhaps when feelings had cooled, because surely none of this was intentional harm. I poured him water and sat opposite him with my back straight, the way you sit when you decide your spine will do the speaking your mouth has been too polite to attempt, and I told him that nothing had disappeared so much as returned to its rightful owner, that I had simply withdrawn my unpaid labor from a system that ran on the assumption that I did not mind being reduced to a clever pair of hands, and I reminded him in patient, almost administrative sentences that the cloud folders were now theirs to manage, that the music plan was no longer my expense to shoulder, and that the domain transfer email contained instructions as simple as find the confirm button and press it. And if that felt like a crisis, perhaps the crisis was not my doing, but the shock of awakening to a world where their conveniences had always been gifts, not entitlements. He listened in the way men listen when a smoke alarm is chirping at 2 in the morning, alert but mildly irritated, and he tried a new tactic, suggesting that my sister was under tremendous pressure at work, that she did not need sabotage layered on top of stress, that family should be a cushion and not a thorn. And in that moment, I felt a wave of tired affection for the way he still framed me as the resilient one who could absorb another slight without bruising, which is an elegant way of saying that my comfort has never made their priority list. He asked whether I had told my mother any of this, and I said I had told them for years in a different language that no one bothered to learn. A language of showing up early and staying late and giving rides and bringing casseroles and fixing logins and remembering birthdays that never came back to me. And since translation had failed, I was now speaking the only dialect anyone seems to respect. The one where you remove your body from the chair and watch who notices the empty seat. He sighed and said the state had already sent a notice about the registered agent change, that the deadline was firm, that the accountant would handle it, but the timing was uncomfortable, and I said that discomfort is often the down payment on clarity. And he winced because phrases like that make people think you have been listening to podcasts that teach boundaries, which to him sounds suspiciously like commercials for disobedience. The knock that followed ours was quick and bright, my sister's rhythm, and she swept in with the kind of smile people wear when they plan to win by acting like nothing is wrong, announcing that she was here to clear up a little misunderstanding. That mom had cried herself into a headache and dad had not slept and her phone would not stop pinging with clients who suddenly could not reach her because emails were bouncing, and surely I did not want her to look unprofessional, not after all the times I had advised her about branding and tone and follow-through, and I watched her cross my living room like the office queen who polishes feedback until it looks like dessert and feeds it to you with a spoon. I told her the transfer window remained open, that all she had to do was confirm ownership and update an address, that she could call her hosting provider and they would hold her hand through the process the way I have held it for years without needing praise or coffee gift cards, and she laughed in that brittle way she does when formality threatens to expose the scaffolding behind her confidence, and she said I could just log in and take care of it since I knew how, and it would take me 5 minutes, and Dad nodded as if she had quoted scripture. I said that 5 minutes have a way of expanding into a life when the person who gives them away is expected to keep doing it forever, and I reminded her that adults who own businesses learn the systems that keep them alive. And if she needed a quick tutorial I could send a link, but the login would not be mine anymore because the responsibility was not mine anymore, and at that her smile wavered in a way I have only seen once or twice, like a stage light flickering in a blackout. And she asked whether I was trying to destroy her, whether this was about jealousy or punishment or some insecurity I needed to name so she could help me fix it. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity had an artistry to it. The suggestion that the person who has stacked chairs after every party is the one smashing the furniture. And I told her that if a single email could endanger her image, perhaps the image was not as sturdy as the applause suggested, and that criticism felt unkind on my tongue even as it felt necessary in the air. For the revenge part, I did not gloat and I did not grandstand. I opened my laptop with a smoothness that startled even me, and I drafted a clean, professional message addressed to her main client contacts, the ones whose emails had bounced because her domain settings were neglected, and I wrote in clear, not poetic language that my involvement as volunteer administrator had ended, that a transition was underway, that they should expect brief interruptions while the new, rightful point of contact assumed full control, and that any urgent matter could be directed to her alternate address listed below, which I added with perfect accuracy, because helping her appear confident while removing myself was the exact combination of mercy and consequence I could live with. The email was not sabotage and it was not smear, it was a spotlight turned toward the new responsible adult, and when I hit send a quiet click like a seatbelt settling into place echoed in my chest, and my sister's phone began to light up in a pattern that looked an awful lot like reality catching up. My father stood and paced the small length of my rug, repeating that this had gone far enough and that there was no need to make a scene, and I told him I had no interest in scenes, only in scenes ending. And as I spoke, my sister's face shifted from confidence to calculation to something like fear, and she asked, in a smaller voice than I know she ever uses at work, what my mother would need to do to get the photos back, because the house felt empty without them playing on the smart display like a looped reassurance that we were still a family, and I said she would need to learn how to upload and tag and share, or she could hire someone, or she could ask me and accept that I would charge fairly, which sounded to them like cruelty and to me like adulthood. When they finally left, leaving the air cooler and sharper, I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the wood in a gesture I recognized from childhood when I used to listen for peace like a secret. And the phone on my table buzzed with a new text, not from my sister and not from my parents, but from my mother's oldest friend, the one who volunteers with her at the church food pantry and knows where the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking. And the message said that my mother had confessed something through tears that the friend was not sure she should repeat, but felt I deserved to hear before it landed on me sideways. And she asked if she could call right now because whatever my mother had been crying about all night was not only the photos or the accounts or the website, but a decision my mother had made years ago that my sister did not know and that my father had allowed. And as the ringtone started and my chest tightened, I realized the ground under my beautiful, precise revenge was about to tilt, and the voice that would answer might hand me a weapon or a wound depending on the sentence that came next. The friend's voice shook in that brittle way people have when they are trying to keep compassion from sliding into complicity, and she told me, with careful pauses that sounded like commas in a confession, that years ago when my grandparents passed and the modest estate was divided, there had been a separate education fund written in the will with language that made my name and my sister's name twins on the page, equal beneficiaries for equal futures. Only somewhere between the lawyer's office and the living room my mother persuaded herself that equality needed interpretation, and after my first semester of community college, when I took a leave to work nights and figure out what I actually wanted instead of pretending, she decided I was not the academic investment while my sister, with her tidy grades and polished recommendations, clearly was, and with my father's reluctant nod she directed the entire remainder toward private coaching, exam fees, apartment deposits, and professional attire for interviews, all under the banner of family strategy, a phrase that sounds like care until you hold it up to light and watch it turn into a loophole. The friend said she had heard pieces over the years, dropped like breadcrumbs after church when my mother needed reassurance that sacrifice counted as love even when the receipt had my name on it, and that last night, with the slideshows gone and the music subscription blinking and the website wobbling like a table with one short leg, the tears finally lifted the lid on the story. And my mother sobbed that she had kept the secret not because she was proud of it, but because she feared the day I would discover the math and decide I was done setting the table at a feast I had helped buy but was never invited to enjoy. I let the friend speak until the words felt finished, then thanked her with more steadiness than I felt, because anger wants a monologue while dignity prefers a ledger. And I sat at my desk and opened a blank document titled Accounting Request in a font that looked like a line drawn with a ruler, and I wrote a polite, surgical letter to my parents asking for a complete accounting of the education fund disbursements pursuant to the estate's terms, the dates, the amounts, the payees, and the rationale, not because I ached to count the money but because I wanted the paper to show them its mirror, and I copied their accountant and the attorney who handled the probate years ago. And I signed with my full name in the way I use it when I want a door to close softly and completely behind me. I did not call, I did not yell, I did not post. I let the click of the send button do what speeches cannot, which is to set a clock running in rooms where people prefer time to be a suggestion. Revenge arrived as restraint sharpened into action that left fingerprints in the right databases, so I pulled my credit reports and saw, like stains blooming under lemon juice, that my name appeared as a former co-signer on my sister's first apartment and on a fitness contract I never signed, and while I could guess the story, that paperwork had felt messy, that I had said something vague about helping, that someone had scribbled a signature that looked enough like mine to pass a sleepy clerk. I refused to let the guests stand in for a record, so I filed formal disputes with copies of my identification. I placed a freeze and a fraud alert, and I attached a short statement that said any future authorization must be in writing and notarized, which is not a barricade raised in fury, but a velvet rope placed at the threshold of my life. I opened the state portal again and submitted a brief form revoking the health information authorizations I had given my mother in a moment of optimism years ago, because being an emergency contact turned me into an errand runner during every crisis, while being the person they accepted help from never turned them into people who respected me afterward. And I updated my own medical file to list a close friend who treats boundaries like oxygen rather than obstacles, and as I saved the changes, I felt my lungs produce a fuller breath than any yoga class has ever delivered. I thought, briefly, about the photo drive and whether to reshare it with a tutorial and a patient list of steps, and then I decided that mercy without memory becomes permission for repetition, so I uploaded a clean starter album labeled Family Archives. Transfer, with a single paragraph explaining that proper archival practice requires the original steward to step back and the current owner to assume the work, and I linked 3 beginner guides that any adult could follow, and I resisted the urge to caption images with little histories of everything I had done to keep our past from dissolving, because the point was not to win a trial by jury but to retire from a job I was never paid to do. My phone began to light up again with messages that sounded like apologies dressed as accusations. My sister asking whether I had gone nuclear when all I had done was open windows. My father suggesting we schedule a calm conversation at the end of the week while forwarding a string of emails from the accountant that used words like fiduciary and exposure, and my mother sending a single line that read, "I was trying to do what was best for you even if you could not see it," which is the kind of sentence that empties itself when you hold it. Because I know how stories calcify if you do not interrupt them with facts, I typed a second letter, cooler than the first, addressed to my sister and her primary clients, clarifying with crisp politeness that the domain transfer required her confirmation and that a brief disruption might occur while records updated, and I provided a simple contact path that did not include me, a thread they could follow without tugging at my sleeves, and then, because revenge is best served with plausible deniability and clean hands, I stepped away from the glowing screens and let the ripples travel without me urging them on. Evening had slipped across the window before I realized I had not eaten, and I stood in my kitchen with a slice of toast and the kind of tired that feels like a fever breaking when the intercom buzzed with the sterile patience of official deliveries. And I pressed the button and heard a courier say my full name with the precision of someone who cannot afford mistakes, and when I signed for the padded envelope and saw the return address stamped from the probate firm that had handled my grandparents' estate, my fingers went cold in that clarifying way that tells you a door is about to open you did not know was there. Inside the envelope was a smaller sealed packet with a label in the lawyer's tidy hand that said to be delivered to the named beneficiary upon written request regarding the education fund or at the attorney's discretion should a dispute arise. And under the packet lay an index card in my grandmother's looping script that simply read "for when you feel invisible," followed by a safe deposit box number I did not recognize, and as the room held its breath, the phone buzzed from across the table with a new message from my sister that said Mom is on her way over and she is bringing something she should have given you years ago, which might make you hate us or forgive us. Please answer the door, and I stood very still with the unopened packet in my palm, wondering whether the truth would arrive as a key or a wound and whether I was ready to let either one into my apartment. When my mother finally stood on my doorstep, she was holding the envelope in both hands as though it contained a fragile organ that might stop beating if she loosened her grip. And behind her my sister lingered with that guilty restlessness of a child who senses punishment coming, but does not yet know which corner of the room she will be told to face. I let them in not because I wanted reconciliation, but because curiosity is its own compass, and the envelope, with its lawyer seal and my grandmother's handwriting, hummed like a key inside a lock I had been pressing against for years. My mother set it down on the table as if the act of releasing it cost her something, and she said in a voice that quivered on every vowel that she should have given it to me long ago, that she had convinced herself it would only hurt me, that she had rationalized with phrases like strategy and practicality, but that in truth she had been afraid of the comparison between daughters, afraid that if both of us had equal footing the balance would tip and reveal which of us could stand alone. I listened without interruption, because silence was the currency I had learned to spend wisely, and as she spoke my sister shifted from foot to foot, her bravado peeled away by the realization that the family she thought was built on celebration had also been built on omission, and that omission had been written with my name scratched faintly in the margins. My mother finally pushed the envelope toward me and whispered that inside were the statements, the records, the annotations my grandmother had left, and that there was also something my grandmother had written in her final months. A letter she had insisted be delivered to me only when the time came, though she had never defined what the time meant, leaving my mother to interpret and delay until guilt forced her to obey. I broke the seal with a deliberateness that filled the room like a drumbeat, and inside were itemized disbursements confirming what the friend had told me, line after line of tuition checks and professional coaching fees with my sister's name in the memo, and a single early payment covering my brief semester before the column for my name stopped entirely. Beneath the papers lay a folded letter, the ink faded but the handwriting steady, and my grandmother's words were plain, unadorned, written with the directness of someone who had no patience for performance. If you are reading this, then you have discovered that people you trusted made decisions in your name without your consent. You must decide whether to fight them for restitution or to take this knowledge as proof that you were always stronger than they allowed themselves to admit. Invisibility is a trick, not a truth. I saw you then, and I see you now. The letter ended without flourish, no instructions for forgiveness, no command to forget, only a signature that curved like a smile pressed into the page, and for a moment I felt a grief so sharp it nearly doubled me. Because all the words I had wanted from my parents had lived in my grandmother's desk, sealed until after her death. My mother began to cry again, not the restrained tears of embarrassment, but the unspooled sobs of someone who has been caught in the act of theft disguised as sacrifice, and she kept saying she was sorry, that she had thought she was protecting me, that she had been afraid of wasting resources on a daughter who seemed uncertain, while my sister buried her face in her hands and muttered that she had never known, that she would never have asked for the help if she had realized what it cost me. I stood and poured myself a glass of water with the composure of a hostess at her own trial, and I told them both that I did not need their tears to validate me, that the years of being overlooked had carved out a resilience in me that no scholarship could have purchased, but that resilience came with a price they had never paid. I said that forgiveness was not a switch to flip because someone had started crying, that healing would not arrive simply because they now wished to hand me papers, and that I would decide in my own time whether their presence in my life was an inheritance worth keeping. My sister looked at me then with something close to fear, not because I had threatened her, but because she understood in that moment that the balance of power had shifted, that the golden child shimmered only when someone else was polishing the surface. And the polish had been mine all along. I kept the letter, I kept the packet, I kept the truth, and when they left I closed the door softly, not as a gesture of kindness, but as a reminder that silence, when chosen, is louder than rage. The house went still, the papers lay heavy on the table, and my phone vibrated again with a message from my sister that read, "You won. But at what cost?" I stared at it for a long time, and I realized that victory and loss can look almost identical when the battlefield is family, and the only clear line between them is the one you draw yourself. I did not reply. Instead, I whispered the last sentence to the empty room, a sentence meant for me alone, though I knew it would echo in the minds of anyone who had ever been invisible in their own home. Funny thing is, I'm not sure what I lost.